I'm calling this talk Rethinking Place as a Strategy for Climate Engagement. I do want to recognize that two of my previous colleagues from the Field Museum are here, and I'm drawing on some of the work that we did together when we were there. But increasingly there are calls, as I'm sure you've heard, to stop focusing on the polar bear in the Arctic in the field of climate change communications and engagement, and start focusing and focus more and more on the hyperlocal. What does climate change mean to people in their backyard? What do they care about? And I want to, if this works, so that's manifesting itself in our work in Chicago, where I am from, and things like focusing on the huge snowstorm that we had and how it stranded people on Lakeshore Drive overnight a couple of years ago, to doing work on things like community gardens and trying to connect those gardens to climate change. I want to challenge that, even though that's been a big part of our work. Together at the Field Museum, I had a team of people. We conducted 9 rapid ethnographic community research studies all throughout the city with all different kinds of populations of diverse socioeconomic and racial and ethnic backgrounds. And we translated this work into a bunch of collaborative programs that involved a whole bunch of different partners and have started to be held up as a model for engagement across the country and some places in Canada. This model really suggests that this move, which is so common in academia but also so common among practitioners in all fields, to go from one extreme to the other extreme is actually extremely problematic because people don't live their lives in hyperlocal ways, no matter who they are, especially in a place like Chicago, but I would argue everywhere in this country because we are a very global country. So what I want to suggest and lay out for you today are just some stories that are going to show how in the lives of the people who we have worked with in Chicago, they live their life at the neighborhood level, they live their life at the regional level, whether that's city, county, state. They live their lives at the national level, connected to other parts of the country, especially in our case, the US South. And many of them live their lives at the global level with serious global connections. And then what this indicates to us is that the local is one place node embedded in a broader conception of place. And that is the way we need to be thinking about place, not as something that is hyper-local. We did our work, both our research and our implementation work, using a lot of different creative methods of storytelling to help understand what people care about. I'm an anthropologist, right, as is Susan. So we're trying to look at what are the cultural and social narratives of people's lives and how does climate fit into that, even if they don't think climate fits in at all, right? And so we used a whole bunch of different methods, which I'm happy to talk about later, to collect stories. And what we discover through this work is that conceptions of place are embedded in these broader cultural frameworks that inform residents' understandings of nature, the environment, and climate change, and that they are embedded really in narratives of kinship, family, and community. So I just want to group some of these together and tell you some stories. And the first finding I want to share for you from our research and our work is that many people become aware of and concerned about climate change through their southern or global connections in communities throughout Chicago. So, for example, in the African-American communities on the south side of Bronzeville and Roseland, many residents related climate change to Hurricane Katrina. When we said, when you hear the words climate change, what comes to mind? That's what they would say. In Roseland, where Lori did her work, a number of residents said they felt a strong connection to African-American communities affected by Katrina, partly because their churches helped with relocation efforts for displaced families who moved to Chicago. On the completely opposite side of the city, in Chicago's northwest side, members of the Polish community told us when they hear climate change that they think about the floods destroying the homes of their family members and friends back in Poland. It doesn't matter if the floods are or not related to climate change, that is what they think of. In Pilsen, which is the main Latino community of the Chicago area, as well as a number of other Latino neighborhoods where we did work, Mexican residents told us about climate refugees emigrating to Chicago as a result of environmental disasters in Mexico, such as droughts and in 2010, hurricanes. In South Chicago, another community on the south side, a woman who grew up in Cuernavaca, Mexico, reported about changes in the weather back in Mexico, where her friends and family still live. So that's focused on impacts, right? They're thinking about the impacts in other places of the country or in their homelands. The second finding is that many people learned climate-friendly practices through personal experiences in or connections to the US South and their home countries or other countries. So again, for example, in the Roseland, African-American community of Roseland, one Roseland resident stays connected to his Mississippi farmland roots through his far south side garden. For more than 20 years, he's planted African vegetables, okra, several varieties of tomatoes and peppers, collard greens, and others on a 3.5-acre plot that he has cultivated and shared with his neighbors. He regularly drives to Mississippi to visit relatives and purchase seeds, and one year he had a prize-winning 10-pound sweet potato that he took with him to be recorded in a county fair growing competition. Huge connections from and back to the US South, which is an integral part of his life. In the Mexican communities that we studied, residents told us about campaigns from Mexico that remind them to conserve water in Chicago, including a 1970s TV campaign called Ciérrale, which means turn it off. One resident said it was as popular as the US Got Milk ads. Another resident from Monterey told us that you can only use your hose on certain days. Everyone is careful to conserve water. And somebody on the southwest side of Chicago described his conservation of water not as a result of necessity, but as a habitual practice passed down from his father and rooted in his father's concern over water scarcity in Mexico. In Poland, this is a photo of a man and his mother, both from Poland. He's a contractor, and he learned about green practices through relatives in Poland. This woman, who doesn't speak English, she gardens and grows vegetables in her garden, and it's hard to see, but she's holding a little tool. She brought that tool with her from Poland. She did not buy it in the United States. And I want to just point out with that Polish narrative that those practices are not just practices, they are part of, for this family, and we saw this a lot with the Poles we interviewed, creating a Polish home. So this family moved from Chicago to the suburbs when the grandmother arrived. As I said, the grandmother grows vegetables using tools from Poland. She cooks homemade Polish dishes. The children attend Polish Saturday school. The grandpa heads a coalition of Polish hometown associations in the city. The father learned about things from Poland, and it's all part of living a Polish life that is connected, very grounded in Chicago, a Polish-American life. So the third finding is that a number of programs that community organizations run that are related to climate action, even if they don't think they are related to the strategies that we think we want people to do. Link Chicago neighborhoods to other parts of the region and to other countries. So for example, in the Roseland area, there are soul food farmers markets that a church is running as part of a program called George Washington Carver Farms. You know that name? A farm-to-table organization named to honor the memory of Dr. George Washington Carver, very grounded in African-American history. The organization is dedicated to facilitating the distribution of soul food vegetables and fruits from African-American farmers in other parts of the state and the Midwest to black consumers in Chicago. Produce comes partly from Pembroke, location A, far south from Chicago, to the Roseland community from a place called Hopkins Park, which is home to a big community of African-American farmers practicing traditional African-American farming methods. So one farmer who participates in this farmer's market inherited 5 acres of land from his father, who moved to Hopkins Park from Mississippi during the 40s and has since increased his property to 29 acres. Like other farmers there, he doesn't use pesticides or herbicides. He rotates his crops yearly, following, as he says, what George Washington Carver advocated, and passes on his heritage and practices to his 9 children who work the land with him. So this is part, just like that Polish narrative was Polish, this is part of living life as being an African American, as part of that history. And a big part of that, too, is reclaiming farming traditions. So another thing we found in African American communities is a desire to distance themselves from agricultural practices that are associated with slavery and shame. And a big part of what community organizations are trying to do in many places in Chicago is reclaim connections to the land as a proud part of African heritage. This is an example of a council, thank you, the Council of Islamic Organizations is promoting campaigns for green Ramadan that promote green living and climate action among Chicago region Muslims as part of a long-term solution to social disasters in Africa, including drought and famine in Somalia. And then again, back to the Polish community, we see that the civic sector in Chicago is very much supported by Poles who have moved out to the suburbs. This is typical of immigrants, right? They move into the cities. When they get wealthier, they move out to the suburbs. A lot of them come back to the city for church on the weekends, and they support the civic organizations, just like that family. The father was the head of civic associations in the city, but they had moved to the suburb. Also, they get a lot of support from new immigrants who are constantly coming in from Poland. This Polish community has a very long history of supporting causes and disasters in Poland since the 1980s. So they were raising money and medical goods and supplies to send to Poland when there was almost economic collapse then. And then more recently, in 1997 and 2010, you may recall that there were huge floods in Poland. And they raised money and sent it back for those floods. Not only that, but one research participant recalled traveling multiple times back to Poland. He's a contractor with the Polish-American Contractors and Builders Association at his own expense to rebuild homes that had collapsed from the floods. This is what people told us when they heard the words climate change. The Polish-American Chamber of Commerce also took a delegation of contractors to Poland to teach them about green building practices because Europe is ahead of us in that area. And this is a final example of community programs, which I'm going to go through quickly, which is just that in the Pilsen area, this Latino neighborhood, there's the Monarch Butterfly is a big symbol there of immigration rights, and it's become a symbol for climate change too, because Chicago is a big stopover place on the migration of the monarch from Mexico to Canada. And so there are calls to really create more habitat for the butterfly. So it's become a symbol of immigration rights that can also be used as a symbol of environmental rights and climate action. And this is a new garden that we helped the community build that uses monarchs everywhere as a way to tie in Mexican culture with climate change and a replacement for the coal power plants that have just recently shut down there. So what are the lessons for action? And I want to argue that there are 5 of them here. That working in communities across scales is key to meeting people where they're at, which we always say we want to do, but hyperlocal does not do. Tying into things they care about. It requires focusing on heritage, and we can think about heritage as a co-benefit. We always think about money, saving money as a co-benefit. People want all sorts of things, and one of the things they want is to continue living, as we heard this morning, to continue being free to live their ways of life and pass on their heritage to their kids. It also allows community-based climate work to support and benefit from regional planning efforts, which are increasingly becoming the norm all over the US. Especially we see that a lot too in ecology. There's a lot of emphasis on bioregions and planning as bioregions and looking at how ecological systems are connected. And finally, I want to suggest that a broader place-based model for climate action that links neighborhood assets and conditions to regional, trans-regional, and global issues encourages collaboration and systems thinking, which many of us in the research world think is key, and nurtures creative problem solving. And related to that, and this is how I want to end, it addresses local leaders' desire to expand the physical and imaginative realms of community possibility. Carolyn Thomas, who's listed here as one of our heroes, activists in the Chicago area, said that she works on climate change with youth, especially because we aspire to what's around us, but when viewing climate change, we get a chance to see the entire world and our visions become global opportunities. So the youth, she says, stop thinking I could be a fireman or a policeman in my community and start thinking, oh, maybe I could be a global inventor. Thank you.